Hi, this is Jesper from Velocitypeak. This is the second part in the XParticles and Cinema 4D tutorial Triggered Advection. In the first part, we built this shape with the teeth animating out. And in this part, it's all about the particles. So this is what we're going to do today. And if you want to follow along, all the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. Okay, let's jump in. Okay, so this is part 2 in the Triggered Advection tutorial. And in the first part, we built this object with teeth that animate out and then they go back inside. And these teeth are going to drive the advection of an explosion effects. So let's see how we can do it. I'm going to go to the XParticles menu and add a system. And I always prefer to have that below the object, so I'm going to put it there. And on this first emitter, this emitter is going to drive the advection. It's going to ignite explosion later. I'm going to call this one ignite. Spell it correctly, like so. And let's go to the object tab. So the shape, we want to switch that from an ellipse to an object. And we're going to use that tube. And then for the selection, we're going to use that selection that we saved the last time. And then we want to emit from, instead of the polygon center, let's do the polygon area. And I'm going to do one more thing here, and that's stick particle to source object. And that means that the particles are going to be stuck to the surface regardless of where the teeth are. So to illustrate that, let's go to display and change the size of these to a circle so we can actually see it. And if I play back, you can see that they're sticking to the surface. They're sticking to the teeth. And if I go to the emission tab, you can see that we do have a speed of 100, but it completely ignores that because the stick to the surface overrides this. Let's change a few things here, though. I'm going to set this to shot. And on the first frame, I'm going to have 500 particles. And although it is ignoring the speed right now, later on, we will unstick the particles and then the speed will make a difference. So I'm going to set speed of 50 and a variation of, say, 27 or 25. And I'm going to up the radius to 10. So now when we play back, we get this. Okay, so what we want is that when the teeth are out a certain part, we want these particles to get unstuck, and then they're going to trigger the explosion effects. So how can we do that? Well, let's go to modifiers, and we can go to control modifiers, and then we have something called XP trigger action. So the XP trigger action is going to trigger either an action or other modifiers when a certain condition is met. So right now the operation is fall off is greater than or equal to. And then what we can do is if we go into fall off, we can add a fall off object. So basically this is a field. And I'm going to go and I'm going to add a torus field. Now to see this a little bit better, I'm going to go to the front view. So F4 for the front. And let's change a few things here. Let's get some space. In the field, let's switch this to Z+. And then I'm going to up this, the size of this. So I'm going to set it to 143. So it's just a little bit bigger than our object. I'm going to go to the remapping and I'm going to set the inner offset to 100. So it's going to be full on. The moment it's inside of the shape of this torus, we're going to have a full effect. Okay, so let me go to the perspective view. So now let's go back to the trigger action and to the object tab. So we want to go to, first of all, actions. And I want to add an action, add action. And by default, we're going to get editor display. So we can see what's going to happen if I enable this, change editor display. And let's say this should be circle as well. We can see what's going to happen. So when it reaches the torus, the trigger action, well, it's triggered at that point. But I'm gonna undo this. I don't want to do the change editor display. But what I do want, if I go to other actions here, I want to unstick this from the source. So you can see what happened if I go a little further down. We have the actions folder here, unstick from source action. So if I play this back now, you can see that now they are being released. And of course, you can play with this. So the size of the torus field, if you want it to be just fewer of them to be unstuck, you can just increase the size of that. But I'm going to leave it at 143. I think that was pretty good. Okay, so now I want to have something more happen. I don't want them to just be unstuck. I actually want them to ignite an Skillshare source or an Skillshare object. So let's go to Dynamics and let's get an Skillshare effects. And let me go back to the first frame. I'm going to make this Skillshare effect a little bigger. So I'm going to stretch it out a little taller, a little wider. So, and let's make it a little thinner. The smaller this box is, the faster the playback. But it needs to be big enough for this to work. So let's leave it at that. Now I'm going to go to the Solver tab. And the voxel size, the resolution of this, we can increase that to 8. We're not going to render smoke or fire, so this can be bigger. And if you have a bigger voxel size, this is going to be quicker in the viewport. So let's see what we get. Well, we don't got anything. We need to do a few more things. First of all, we need something that can ignite Skillshare. So if I go to the emitter, I right-click and I say XParticles tags, and then let's do an Skillshare effects source. I'm gonna increase the pressure, so it's a more volatile explosion. I'm gonna reduce the velocity to just 8, so it's pretty slow. So if we play this back, we still don't get anything because we need the particles to carry fuel. So if I go back to the emitter and to the extended data tab, and let's scroll up here a little bit, and then physical data. Now I can give them fuel like this. So if I say 3 for fuel, if I play it back now, we're gonna get an explosion. But of course it happens right away. So this is not what I want. So let's set this back to 0. And let's go to modifiers. And then under control modifiers, we can get something called XP physical. And in the physical modifiers, we can control things like temperature, smoke, fuel, and fire. Now, I don't want any temperature. I don't want any smoke. I don't want any fire, but I do want fuel. So let's tick change fuel. So the mode is set to change over time. I want this to be set value, and then I'm going to do 3 again. So now, of course, if I play it back, we're going to get the same result because this one triggers right away. But let's go back to the XP trigger action. And next to the actions tab, we have a modifiers tab as well. So what we can do, we can take this XP physical and we can drag it in. And now this modifier is only going to be triggered when the XP trigger action is active, which is when it touches the torus field. So if we play it back now, we're going to get a very different result. So now it's only igniting when it's traveling around the shape like this. So that looks a lot better. So a few things I want to change here though. I don't want the smoke to rise like this. I'm going to go back into the explosion effects, and under the simulation tab, we have the gravity slider, which controls smoke, heat, and fuel buoyancy. It's like an overall slider for these. And if I want to set this to have no rising whatsoever, I can just set this to 0. So now the smoke is not going to rise. I also want to have just a little bit more movement in the smoke. And I can do that in the Forces tab. I can enable some turbulence. And let's leave it at curl. And let's go down to 3. 3 is going to be plenty. So now we just have more movement in the smoke. So I don't want to render smoke. Now I want to advect some particles from this. So I'm gonna hide or disable explosion effects for a while, because what I want to do is I want to have some particles spawning from these original particles, and those particles are going to be advected from the explosion effects. So I'm going to go to modifiers, and then I'm going to go to generate modifiers, and I'm going to go get an XP spawn. And the XP spawn needs to have an emitter to work. So we can do add spawning emitter. So it created an emitter for us here. Let's call this one XP emitter spawn, like so. And I'm going to go to the emission. And I'm going to set up the speed to something like 184. And radius of 3 is fine, but I'm going to set a variation of 2. And these spawned particles are going to be the ones that we render in the end. So I want to go to display, and I'm going to change the color mode from single color to gradient and just random. And let me pull this up. I'm going to make these black to white, and we'll recolor these later on when we render. So let me put this as a black. And let's see. So let's just play this back and see what we get. Okay, so we get particles right away. So let's go back to, first of all, let's go back to the spawning modifier. And I'm going to have spawn particle speed to absolute. Spawn number right now is 300 spawns per second. I am going to switch that to per frame. And later on, we're going to increase this to 25. But for now, let's do 5 just to make sure things work. And we don't want them to spawn right away. So I'm going to go back to our trigger action, and I'm going to pull in the XP spawn as well. So now we're going to get spawning when the triggered action is happening. And if we enable Explosia at this point and go to the Advection tab, we can say Advect Particles and enable that. Now I don't want to affect smoke. All these channels are available to us, but I don't want to use any of them except the velocity. So I'm just gonna set all these to 0 and just keep velocity. And we don't need to see the explosion effects. So let's play this back. So now we are getting advection, but now our ignite emitter is affected by this as well. So if I go to the modifiers tab, we can exclude the explosion effects, and I want to do that. So let's bring in explosion effects, so it's no longer affecting the ignite particles, and let's play this again. You know what? Let's do this also. Let's go back to our ignite particles, and let's set them to display, and then just do dots, so they're not so overwhelming. And then let's zoom in. Okay, so now we are getting the particles, and they're getting the noise from the curl that we set up in Explosion Effects. Now, bear in mind, we're only getting around 6 frames per second. This is going to be a lot quicker when we play it back. So what I'm going to do, 2 things. I'm going to add just a little bit more movement to the particles, and I'm also going to slow them down. So let's start by adding some extra movement. So to modifiers, I'm going to add just a standard XP Turbulence. And I want this turbulence to affect only the spawned particles. I'm going to go back to the XP emitter, and in the modifiers tab, I'm just going to drag the turbulence in there. So it's not affecting the ignite particles. And in the turbulence, instead of a noise type of standard, let's set this to be curl. And scale, let's do this a lot smaller, 30. Frequency of 100 octaves 1, it's fine. I'm going to increase the strength. And if I play this back now, this is the result. So I think, especially when we play this back at the real speed, this is going to be too much. So I'm going to blend this back a little bit. So blend, let's blend this back with the original particle speed. I'm going to do like maybe 13. And add how much curl we want to add. Let's do, say, like 14. And then we're going to get this. So I think overall that is pretty good, but I also want to slow this down a little bit. And one way we can do that is if we go to the motion modifiers again, we can add some XP drag. And we have all these mediums we can use, air, helium, and so on. One I like to use is treacle, which is like a syrupy, really sticky, thick liquid of some sort. And that's going to make it a lot slower. So if I play it back, you can see how much slower that is. So I'm going to go a little less heavy on that. So say 43, I think I used in the original example. If I play this back, we're getting this. Now you can experiment with the looks here, of course. Now this is affecting both emitter, for example. But I would experiment with this and see how far you can get with this. But this is kind of like the base setup. Now we need more particles at this point. So I'm going to go to the XP spawn and then up this to 25. Now the amount of spawns that you actually get also greatly depends on how many particles that you are igniting to begin with. We're doing 500, but if I do more here, you may have to reduce the spawns, or if you have a lower shot count here, you have to increase the amount of spawns, depending on what you're going for. But you just want to be aware that these two numbers, they affect each other. So with all these particles, playback, we're going to get this now. Like so. I mean, this is the base setup, and let's go and render this. But before we do that, let me just show you the elements I already have in this scene. Let me twirl this one up. So I have some other elements in the scene. I have a camera. I have an 80mm camera set up. And then I have Cycles 4D tag on that. We're going to render with Cycles 4D. I have just a little bit of depth of field, 0.1. And then I also have a background plane. So if I look at this from a different angle, I have a background plane. And then I have two softboxes. I'm using the latest release of Cycles 4D. So if I go to Cycles 4D, Light Kits, we have something called a softbox now. And I like these. I like these for a few different reasons. But one is that you can easily create a material. In here, you can add gradients and noises, so it's not so even material. We also have a target slot, so we don't need to use a target tag anymore. So I can simply take my tube and just drag it into the target spot. Let me do that to the other one as well. I always like to use targets when I work with my lights. So now if I move the tube, these would follow. This is just very handy to have, and it's a time saver. I really appreciate that. I'm also using an environment, and I'm using HDRI Link from Grayscale Gorilla. And obviously, if you don't have that plugin, just use any other HDRI map that you have. I always recommend HDRI Haven. They have some really good HDRI maps. So let's go into the camera. And let me twirl this up. And in order to render this, we also need to add a tag to our spawning emitters. So let me right click and say XParticles tags. In fact, that's not what I want at all. I want the Cycles 4D tags. So we need to put an instance tag there. And it renders each sphere with 24 segments. So that's a lot of geometry, especially when we have a lot of particles right like this. So I'm going to reduce this right down to 8. And I'm going to do size multiplier of 20. So now we are ready to render. So I'm just going to switch my layout. Okay, so I've switched to my Cycles 4D layout. We have the node editor on the left side, and then we have the real-time preview in the center. And then we have our regular view here, and the objects manager, and the attributes manager as well here. So the first thing I'm going to render is, or create, is the material for the actual tube or the object. So I'm going to go back to one of the first frames. So it's not so heavy as we build this. And I'm going to go to Cycles 4D and to Surface Extended. And I'm going to use this glass dispersion. This is a pretty interesting material. And I also want to enable the bevel and the cloth surface. And let's just press play and see what we get. And let me reduce the samples to say 4 when we do this. And we need to actually apply it, of course. So let's add this to the tube. And there you go. So this is a really interesting shader. Not sure who made it, but it's pretty interesting, very colorful. I'm going to do a few things to this, though, to begin. I'm going to up the roughness to just 0.5, so it's not so smooth. But the main thing that I'm going to do with this, I'm going to up the IOR, which is going to make it a lot less transparent. So now we have this. I also want to add a little bit more colors to this. So I'm going to, let's move these guys over so I have some more room. Let me add a texture and just a standard noise texture. And I'm going to leave everything at its default for this noise texture. If I solo this, so we can see what it looks like, I'm going to get this. Now I'm going to change the mapping of this. So in order to do that, I'm going to right click and say input and then texture coordinate. And then this object one is usually a good one to use, especially when you don't have a UV unwrapped object like we do. Or we don't have it UV unwrapped, I should say. So now we get this mapping. And so I want to have some of these colors on this object, but of course, I don't want it to look like this. So I'm going to get a input and just a standard RGB. And this, I'm going to make it perfectly white, so pure white. So I'm going to blend between the noise texture and this RGB. And the way we can do that, again, let's try to get some extra space. So let's go and get a color, and we can do mix. Oops. Let's do mix RGB. And I'm going to put the white color in the top slot. And then I'm going to get the noise texture in the bottom. And let's solo this now. So now we're going to get a blend between these. But I want to control this with a layer weight node. So I'm going to right click and say input. And then we want to go for layer weight. And so this is going to control this based on the fall off of the viewing angle. So the reflection base. You usually use this with reflection. You get more or less depending on the viewing angle. So I'm going to use facing. I'm going to put that into the factor. And we can play with this now. If we want to have more colors in there, we can actually up the blend if we want to. Or if we want to have less, we can bring it lower. So I'm going to leave it at, say, 0.458 around there. I think that's pretty good. And then I'm going to take the color, pipe it into the glass dispersion color, and unsolo this. And this is going to be the final look for this. So we just have a hint of more colors in there, which I kind of like. And let's also create the colors for the particles. So I'm going to go to Cycles 4D and then just a standard object material. And let me put that onto our particles, which is this guy. And I'm going to leave pretty much everything at its default in this guy, but I will use the colors that we set up at the beginning. We used gradient random. So if I go, I say input and then particle info, and then we can pipe those colors from the particles into the base color. And let me go a few frames forward so we can see some more particles. I don't want to go too many frames because if you have a lot of particles, it's much slower to update. But let's see, this frame might be good. Okay, so that's good. Let me make sure, did I actually set this up to 25 for the XP spawn? Let me double check. I did. Okay, so we're going to get a heck of a lot more particles. So let me see. So let's add a converter color ramp, and let's pipe that in between. And let's see, what kind of colors am I going to do? Well, my original one, I made them like a bright pink purple colors. I think the inspiration was that we have the cherry blossom here in Japan. So I try to mimic those colors. Let me see. Let me make this a little bluer, perhaps. A little lighter. So, I mean, something like that. It's all to taste. Now it's all up to you how you want to play this. Let's go to a frame where we have a lot more particles. Let's see. I don't want to make you wait too long. Let's wait just a few more. Okay, so let's say we pick this frame. And let me get some extra space. And let's bring up the size to 100. And let's play this. Let's see what we get. Okay. Okay, so that's what we're gonna get. I'm gonna up the sample so we can take a look at a slightly higher resolution or higher quality final image. I do want to point out this though, when you go out for render, whether it's a still or animation, you want to go to other objects and make sure that you cache this. So add a cache to this. Another thing that I want to point out is that if I go to my render settings and in the cycles 4D options, if you get some fireflies, really hot, bright spots, you may have some fireflies. So I clamp my indirect to 4. By default, this is going to be set to 0, but I think I got some fireflies with 0. So let me play this back. Yeah, you can see the fireflies are happening here. So I set it to 4. Now, this is not intuitive, but 1 is actually max to clamp indirect the fullest. So if you set it to 4, it's not so harsh, but you get rid of most of the fireflies. You may have to go a little bit more aggressively with that, but I think that took care of most of it. And another thing that I do want to point out is that I do have max ray bounces set up to 5. And in the latest release of Cycles 4D, they changed it from 1 to 12. The default is 12. But if you have an older version of Cycles 4D, the max ray bounces is only 1. So if you have an older version and is wondering why you're getting a much darker result, well, that's because you don't have enough ray bounces. So this is always a push and pull. I found that 5 is going to be enough for this scene. So it's just good to keep in mind. All right, let me bring this up to, I think my final samples for my animation was 18. So I'm going to play this back, and I'll be back once this has chugged along and is finished. Okay, so the render here has finished. And I think I used 18 samples in my original animation. That brings this tutorial to an end. If you come up with something cool using these techniques, shoot me a link. I'd like to see it. And if you got some value out of this, consider subscribing. All the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. Thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.